In the early morning hours of the 6th of June 2023, a series of powerful explosions rocked the Novokakhovka Dam here in southern Ukraine, one of the largest dams in the entire country, the aftermath of which was captured by this aerial drone footage that you're watching right now. Behind the dam was a reservoir of water containing around 18 million cubic meters worth of water, roughly equivalent to the volume contained within the entire Great Salt Lake in the US state of Utah. And that's the water you're watching right now flooding through the blown-up dam downstream towards tens of thousands of civilians and their homes. Shortly after this video was filmed, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, tweeted that Russia was responsible and that it likely constituted the greatest technological disaster in European history seen in decades. The Russians, conversely, blamed the Ukrainians for the dam's sudden destruction, which is extremely unlikely, for reasons that I'll get into very quickly. The dam's destruction sent a flood surge of water downstream the Dnipro River that directly placed tens of thousands of civilians at risk, and likely destroyed electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes that once relied on the power the hydroelectric dam generated. Kherson, a major city that had a pre-war population of nearly 300,000 people, sits directly downstream from this dam, and the floodwaters its destruction unleashed. And moreover, the dam's destruction is likely to generate catastrophic consequences for Ukrainian agriculture and even Russia's own control over Crimea, while also generating new fears over a potential nuclear meltdown at Europe's largest nuclear power plant further upstream from the dam. In effect, the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam and the biblical scale flood it has caused in Ukraine represents one of the most significant humanitarian and economic disasters seen in Europe this century, and it marks a major escalation and turning point during the war in Ukraine, and the consequences of it will reverberate across the battlefields in the future of the country for years or even decades to come. So let's take a closer look at what all of this really means, and why this is all happening in Ukraine right now. The Dnipro River itself is probably the most geographically significant feature in the whole of Ukraine. It runs across the entire length of the country from north to south, and it splits the country roughly in half. In a sense, the Dnipro River is basically like Ukraine's version of the Mississippi River, but the river doesn't begin in Ukraine. Its headwaters rise further to the north within Russia, nearby to the city of Smolensk, where it is locally known as the Dnieper River, before then running through Belarus and then finally on into Ukraine, where it finally empties at its delta by the city of Kherson in the Black Sea. It is the fourth longest river on the European continent, and during the Soviet era, the river became well known for its major hydroelectric dam projects and big reservoirs. For most of its history, the river wasn't a fully navigable one all the way from the sea to the interior, because of a series of rapids blocking maritime traffic from passing through. The Soviets were determined to finally fix that problem as a part of their series of industrial waterworks on the river beginning in the late 1930s. And so the rapids were fully inundated by the modern Dnieper Reservoir by the early 1930s, transforming roughly 2,000 kilometers worth of the river from the Black Sea all the way up to the city of Dorogobuzh in Russia into usable, navigable waters. This transformed large Soviet cities at the time deep within the interior like Kyiv into somewhat oceanic-capable ports for ships and barges under a certain size, and tremendously benefited the Ukrainian and Soviet economies in the process. All in all, the Soviets constructed a total of 6 dams along the course of the Dnipro River. Dams that not only made the river largely navigable, but also generated large amounts of hydroelectricity for Ukraine's growing population and economy. The southernmost of these dams along the river that the Soviets built was the Novokakhovka Dam that was completed in 1956. Just 2 years after the Soviet Union formally internally transferred the Crimean Peninsula from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic over to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The dam's purpose and the reservoir behind its purpose were each designed to significantly benefit the local Ukrainian and the greater Soviet economy. Between the dam's completion and into the 1980s, a series of canals were dug from the reservoir behind the Novokakhovka Dam to bring water across the fields of southern Ukraine that changed its environment forever. Prior to the construction of these canals, much of southern Ukraine, including Crimea, was a warm and arid steppe with good fertile soils that would usually be great for farming, but with very little available water. Agriculture was historically nearly impossible nonetheless. The Soviet-built canals changed this by finally bringing water to these otherwise ideal agricultural areas. They quickly led to massive farms opening up all across the south of Ukraine, to the point where the Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces became some of the most agriculturally productive regions in the whole of Europe, with abundant wheat, soybean, and barley production. Among these canals that the Soviets built out of the Novokakhovka Reservoir was the North Crimean Canal, which began construction in 1957, a canal that diverts water from the reservoir behind the Novokakhovka Dam down to the Crimean Peninsula. This was highly important for Crimea's ability to properly develop, because with nearly 90% of the peninsula's territory is an arid steppe environment that receives very little rainfall throughout the year. Most of Crimea's land only receives an average of 300 to 500 millimeters of rainfall in a given year, which, for the sake of comparison, is pretty similar to the annual rainfall experienced in Kabul, Afghanistan. Without man-made intervention, finding enough fresh water in Crimea for the irrigation required by industrial-scale agriculture was basically impossible, and so the peninsula couldn't support very many people all on its own. The North Crimean Canal changed all of this forever until the month this video was released. It diverted massive volumes of freshwater from the Dnipro River down to the peninsula to the point where approximately 85% of all the freshwater consumed in Crimea was coming from it alone. Crimean agriculture and heavy industry were all suddenly possible, and then later on in the 1980s, the Soviets constructed the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant along the banks of the dam's reservoir further to the north as well. It would ultimately become Europe's largest nuclear power plant, capable of generating approximately 5,700 megawatts of electricity, and use the waters of the reservoir to cool down their nuclear reactors and spent nuclear fuel rods. But that was all back during the Soviet era. Decades later, in 2014, the Russians invaded Ukraine for the first time and occupied and then annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Almost immediately after Russia's annexation, the Ukrainians decided to retaliate in really the only way that they were capable of doing at the time. The North Crimean Canal, as it always had, began in the reservoir almost immediately behind the Novokakhovka Dam, and since that area was still under their control, they decided to fill the North Crimean Canal's entrance up with concrete, and so blocked off 85% of the Crimean Peninsula's water supply. Doing so placed enormous pressures on the Russian government to adequately provide water on the peninsula for Crimea's 2.4 million residents and all of their agriculture and industry. The area of land under agricultural cultivation in Crimea crashed by nearly 90% without the North Crimean Canal's water supply. And by 2020, many of the peninsula's residents were being forced into rationing their water supply. Ukraine was successfully besieging Crimea and placing pressure on the Russian authorities there, which is part of the reason why the Russians ultimately decided to launch their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In the opening days of the invasion last year, one of the very first things that the Russians did was to secure control over the entire length of the North Crimean Canal and destroy the dam that the Ukrainians had blocked it with, freeing up the water to flow back down the canal again towards Crimea for the first time since 2014, and relieving Crimea of its chronic water supply problem. But the Novokakhovka Dam right by the canal's entrance came up in the news a lot during Ukraine's southern Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022 last year. You see, there's a bridge that runs across the top of the Novokakhovka Dam, and it represented one of only 3 highly strategic crossings of the Dnipro River anywhere nearby to the city of Kherson. With a pre-war population of nearly 300,000 people, Kherson represented the largest city in Ukraine that the Russians had managed to capture since their invasion began. But it was also located on the western bank of the Dnipro River, exposed to the rest of Ukraine across a flat and open plain, and separated from the rest of Russian-occupied territory by the river and those 3 strategic crossings. From Ukraine's perspective, this would have been the best time for them to have been the ones to blow up the Novokakhovka Dam, because doing so would have flooded the Dnipro River downstream and denied the Russians the ability to adequately resupply their troops over on the other side occupying Kherson city. Thousands of Russian troops and their equipment would have found themselves stranded on the wrong side of the river, effectively encircled by Ukrainian troops with no meaningful way to acquire resupplies and nowhere left to retreat to. A Dunkirk-type situation for the Russians that would have ostensibly enabled the Ukrainian armed forces to advance and completely wipe them out as casualties or prisoners. But that's not what the Ukrainians ended up doing. Instead, American-supplied HIMARS in Ukrainian service managed to target and eliminate the 2 other bridges further downstream, leaving the Novokakhovka Dam open as the sole remaining bottleneck for resupplies and troop movements across the river. As the Ukrainian forces then advanced closer to Kherson city, the Russians made the decision in November of 2022 to tactically retreat thousands of their soldiers and supplies from the city back over to the eastern bank of the Dnipro, surrendering Kherson city to the Ukrainians without a fight in the process. That ended up getting us to basically the current state of the military front line between Ukraine and Russia, that for a large portion in the southwest currently follows the course of the Dnipro River, dividing Ukrainian-held territory to the west of the river and Russian-occupied territory to the east of the river. For months now, the Ukrainians have been actively planning their much-anticipated counteroffensive against the Russian front lines, having been freshly armed and equipped with advanced Western tanks, mechanized infantry, and artillery systems. While the specifics of the counteroffensive are still fairly vague, The ultimate objective of it is fairly obvious. The Ukrainians are going to want to break through the Russian front lines somewhere, and then advance far enough to the Sea of Azov, in order to sever Russia's so-called land bridge. The area of Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine that currently stretches from Russia proper across the Ukrainian provinces of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson towards Crimea. If this land bridge is severed, then Russia's ability to reinforce Crimea by land becomes impossible when combined with the destruction of the Crimean bridge across the Kerch Strait, which was already partially destroyed by a likely Ukrainian attack back in October of 2022. From Russia's perspective, this development would effectively transform Crimea into an island, only capable of resupply by air and sea, and would thus place further pressures on Russia's ability to actually continue holding the peninsula, and their strategic naval headquarters for the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol. The most significant problem that the Russians face during this upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive is that the current front line is massive. It stretches for more than 900 kilometers across Ukraine, and the Russians only have a limited amount of manpower available to adequately fill the whole front line up with bodies. The Russians cannot evenly distribute all of their troops across the entire 900-kilometer wide front. Because if they did that, then the Ukrainians could simply concentrate the overwhelming resources of their counteroffensive at a single lightly defended area, and overwhelm the local Russian defenses. But even worse for Russia, they have been running lower and lower on manpower ever since their invasion began. For the past several months, the Russian armed forces, and specifically their mercenary Wagner group, have all concentrated the overwhelming majority of their own offensive capabilities into besieging and capturing the city of Bakhmut within the Donetsk province. The ferocity of the fighting around Bakhmut has been the most relentless of the entire war so far, and has often been compared to the scale and devastation of the two world wars and the Battle of Verdun that was waged between the Germans and the French across 1916. By the end of May 2023, just last month before this video was published, the mercenary Wagner group and Russia were each claiming that the city had finally been captured, after nearly 10 months worth of savage fighting. But in order to do so, they have almost certainly suffered a catastrophic rate of casualties. Western sources currently estimate that the Russian and Wagner forces suffered somewhere in the ballpark of 60,000 casualties during the battle for Bakhmut, 20,000 of whom were killed in action. To put that into perspective, that is around the same number of casualties that the Soviet Union collectively experienced during their entire 9-year invasion of Afghanistan all throughout the 1980s. All suffered during just a single battle in Ukraine for a single town. Meanwhile, Western sources also estimate that the Ukrainian side has suffered around 20,000 casualties of their own during the same battle. Up to May of 2023, the United States believes that since the invasion began in February of 2022, the Ukrainian armed forces have suffered around 150,000 casualties killed and wounded, while the Russian armed forces have so far suffered around 230,000 casualties killed and wounded. That is a higher number of casualties on the Russian side than the entire initial invasion force that the Russians sent into Ukraine to begin with, which was only around 190,000 soldiers. So, in order to compensate for these massive numbers of casualties, the largest Russia or Ukraine have experienced since World War II, the Russians have adopted a set of two different strategies. The first and most straightforward has been to simply recruit more bodies to shove into the front lines to plug up all the gaps. Last year, in September of 2022, Russia announced a partial military mobilization of reservists, intended to call up 300,000 more men to throw into the war. By February of 2023, many of these hundreds of thousands of freshly called up troops had already arrived on the battlefield, and by May of 2023, Russia likely had around 300,000 plus active military personnel within their occupied territories in Ukraine, despite having already suffered nearly 250,000 casualties. Nonetheless, 300,000 men defending a 900-kilometer-long front line is a difficult task to accomplish, and the Russians still have to strategically choose where they position all of them. This gets us into the second strategy that Russia can use to compensate for their losses in manpower: reduce the length of the front line itself, and reduce the total area their limited manpower needs to actually defend. The most obvious way for the Russians to have done this for a while was by blowing up the Novokakhovka Dam and flooding the entire length of the Dnipro River along the current front line between the dam and the river's delta by Kherson City. With the bridge crossings over Novokakhovka now destroyed, and the former two bridges destroyed long ago, there isn't a single crossing point anywhere between the river's delta and the city of Zaporizhia. And with the river's width significantly expanded downstream by the flooding, the Ukrainian armed forces will now find it extremely challenging to cross, as they will need boats or long long pontoon bridges that will take a lot of time to set up, while they will be easy targets for entrenched Russian machine gun and artillery systems over on the river's eastern bank. Moreover, as the reservoir behind the dam depletes in size, it will leave behind muddy banks on either side, and as the river downstream of the dam finishes flooding, it will also leave behind muddy banks on either side of it. Basically, blowing up the Novokakhovka Dam creates an extremely difficult geographic obstacle for counter-attacking Ukrainian forces to cross over from Zaporizhia in the north to Kherson City in the south. And this difficult obstacle to cross will likely exist for at least a month or longer. In theory, this means that with the length of the river south of Zaporizhia secured against a large-scale Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians can now afford to safely redeploy many of their limited soldiers from this part of the front line to plug up less defensible areas where the Ukrainians are more likely to attack across, like in these areas on the flat, open plains across the occupied sections of the eastern Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk provinces, where the terrain will more favor Ukraine's recently acquired advanced Western tanks and mechanized infantry, as they seek to break through the Russian lines and carve across to the Sea of Azov. Since the Novokakhovka Dam has been under the control of the Russians ever since the invasion began, they've held this as an option now for months, and they've had plenty of time to rig it with explosives. And it appears that they've been preparing to do it for a long time. The Ukrainian authorities have been warning for months now that the Russians were preparing to blow up the dam. And in the months leading up to the dam's ultimate destruction on the 6th of June, the Russians were known to have been keeping the dam's sluice gates deliberately closed. That effectively meant that they were holding the Dnipro River's water back in order to raise the reservoir's water level behind the dam. As a result, in addition to record springtime rainfall and snowmelt, the reservoir's water level behind the dam had reached an all-time record depth of 17.5 meters immediately before the dam was destroyed. This clearly shows that in the months leading up to the dam's destruction over 2023, the Russians were operating the Novokakhovka Dam in a way that would guarantee the maximum level of destruction once the dam was destroyed, unleashing the maximum amount of water possible downstream and generating the worst possible flood. And the timing of the dam's destruction now in June is almost certainly not a coincidence. Beginning on the 30th of May and stretching into the first week of June, the Ukrainians likely began conducting probing assaults into the Russian front lines in search of weak spots and in preparation for the full launch of their wide-scale counteroffensive. A swarm of Ukrainian drones raided Moscow in broad daylight on the 30th of May, representing the first time since 1941 that Moscow was subjected to an air attack. Then, a few days later, Ukrainian-backed militia groups raided across the border into Russia itself in the Belgorod province, where they took control over a bunch of Russian villages, and forced the Russians to redeploy some of their troops from the front line in Ukraine back to their northern border in Russia, while ordering the evacuation of the border town of Shchebekino and its 40,000 pre-war citizens. Massive Ukrainian artillery and rocket strikes were beginning to pepper the Russian front lines, and so, sensing that the long-awaited counteroffensive was probably starting to get underway, the Russians probably took the decision to finally blow up the Novokakhovka Dam and deny this part of the front line as a point for the Ukrainians to advance across, enabling them to concentrate their troops along a narrower section of the front line and dig in. Blowing up dams and flooding areas of the battlefield to restrict your opponent's movements like this have long been a strategy used by militaries all throughout history. During the 19th century, the Dutch famously constructed a series of water-based defenses around the city of Amsterdam that could be deliberately flooded during wartime and effectively transform Amsterdam into an island, and protect the city from a hostile land-based invasion. In 1938, during the Japanese invasion of China, the Chinese Nationalist Army deliberately destroyed a series of dikes on the Yellow River in order to cause a huge flood that would deny the Japanese the ability to advance any deeper into the Chinese mainland. That strategy worked, but it also came at the cost of up to 500,000 Chinese civilian lives. In 1941, nearby to the current flood in Ukraine, the retreating Soviets deliberately blew up a different dam on the Dnieper River in order to flood an area and deny the advancing Germans the pathway to continue advancing. And then in 2022, during the opening days of the current war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians themselves chose to blow up one of their own dams on the Irpin River in order to block off a potential invasion route that the Russians could have otherwise used during their advance on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Much of the area around the Irpin River is still flooded today from this more than a year later, implying that the areas of the Dnipro River further downstream from the Novokakhovka Dam will likely remain at least partially flooded for a long time to come. The Novokakhovka Dam's destruction also carries with it numerous humanitarian and economic consequences that will reverberate across Ukraine and Europe for years or even decades to come. Tens of thousands of people downstream have since been forced to evacuate from their homes, while the city of Kherson itself has experienced significant flooding and damage to thousands of homes. The dam's hydroelectric power station is almost certainly damaged beyond all repair, meaning that it can no longer provide electricity for the around 350,000 households in Ukraine that it used to, only adding to Ukraine's deep electricity woes during Russia's targeted campaign of destroying Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But in the long term, the dam's destruction will more severely affect the Russian-occupied sections east of the Dnieper River, rather than the Ukrainian-held territories west of the river. First of all, the flooding itself has been worse on the Russian-occupied side of the river, because that side of the river is lower in elevation than the western side is, and so it's more exposed to the river's floodplain, with potentially adverse consequences for the first line of Russian military defenses that have been set up along the river's bank, and which are now potentially flooded. Second of all, the destruction of the dam over the long term will likely completely destroy the agricultural economy of southern Ukraine, a region that normally produces nearly a fourth of Ukraine's entire annual crop. Here are those same canals again from before that were all dug out back during the Soviet era, that all provide the overwhelming amount of irrigation required for the farms in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea. In order for all of these canals to function, there has to actually be enough water depth back in the Kakhovka reservoir to actually feed them. So now, with the dam exploded, the reservoir is draining out and flooding downstream into the Black Sea, meaning that there's less volume in the reservoir to feed all of these canals, and they're eventually all going to start running out of water, meaning that all the farms the canals once supported are going to start running dry. There are already reports that with the water volume in the reservoir already massively depleted, the water in these canals have already begun flowing backwards and are draining back into the former reservoir. Since the dam and the river itself are still in the middle of an active war zone, the dam isn't likely to be rebuilt anytime soon, and the consequence is that Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Crimea as well are all likely to devolve back into the arid and dry steppes that they were historically, and Ukraine's agricultural output for the next several years is probably going to crash. And this all might happen really fast too. This map shows what Crimea's vegetation situation looked like back in 2016, only a couple years after the Ukrainians shut off the North Crimean Canal that was providing the peninsula with nearly all of its water. And then, this map shows what Crimea's vegetation situation looked like just 2 years later after that, in 2018, as it was veritably dying of thirst without that water. After a couple more years from now, by 2025, the Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces will probably look pretty similar to this. And moreover, the North Crimean Canal will most likely no longer function as well until the dam and the reservoir are rebuilt, meaning that Crimea has now been permanently severed off from the source of water that was providing it with around 85% of its water. This massive level of destruction caused to the region's agricultural economy and water supply is rather curious, because if Russia truly was responsible for the dam's destruction, they have self-inflicted all of this upon lands that they legally claim to be their own. Last year, in 2022, Russia unilaterally declared that they were annexing Ukraine's Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk provinces all into Russia, in addition to Crimea, which they also declared to annex back in 2014. To unleash this amount of long-term economic destruction within these territories by destroying that dam in exchange for short-term battlefield advantages suggests that the Russians are not extremely optimistic about their long-term future and control of these territories, and it more appears to be a kind of scorched earth tactic. If and when Russia retreats from Kherson and Zaporizhia now, they will be leaving behind a region with a completely sabotaged agricultural and industrial economy that'll be very difficult and very expensive for the Ukrainians to rebuild. Similar to Saddam's tactic back in 1991 when the Iraqi army was retreating from occupied Kuwait and blowing up Kuwaiti oil rigs all along the way. And then there were the further potential consequences for the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant further to the north, the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. The plant relies on the water from the Novokakhovka reservoir to feed its pond, which it uses to cool down its nuclear reactors and spent nuclear fuel rods. Most of the reactors at the plant were turned offline by September of 2022, but the remaining problem is that the spent nuclear fuel rods at the site take several years' worth of time to actually cool down, and they continually need fresh supplies of cool water that entire time to keep cooling. If the plant runs out of water from the Novokakhovka reservoir drying up, that could be bad news indeed. But right now, the International Atomic Energy Agency, a UN watchdog organization with monitors present at the plant, are still saying that there is no immediate emergency to worry about, because the plant has enough reserve water to keep up the cooling for at least the next several months. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is thus not very likely to develop into another Chernobyl-type event for Ukraine, yet, and it will hopefully remain that way. Regardless, Russia's likely intentional destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam is highly likely to be legally classified as a serious war crime. Under the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions that were adopted in 1977, Articles 53 and 56 specifically outlaw military attacks on dams, dikes, and nuclear power stations that will cause severe losses among the civilian population. Interestingly, the Soviet Union signed and ratified these updated protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and then Russia legally inherited that ratification status after it emerged from the Soviet Union in 1991. But then, in 2019, just 3 years before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin signed an executive order that revoked Russia's ratification of the 1977 additional protocols, meaning that from then on, Russia legally disagreed with the international consensus that military attacks on dams constituted as war crimes. Ultimately, the long-term effects caused by the Novokakhovka Dam's destruction will play out over a very long time, and most of its humanitarian, economic, military, and legal consequences will reveal themselves over the coming months and years. It seems like ever since this decade began, there's been a nearly constant stream of bad news to keep all of our attention fixed on our smartphones. For the few minutes we have every day when we're not doing anything and waiting around, whether we're waiting for a class or a meeting to start or waiting for the train or the Uber, we tend to almost instinctively fill them up now by checking through Twitter or scrolling through TikTok or some other way of passing the time that gives us a bit of dopamine, because we think that there's not anything productive or meaningful that we can possibly do in those quick 5 or 10 minute slices of life. But over time, all of those 5 or 10 minute chunks spent waiting around really start to add up. So rather than wasting them, you can use them to learn something new and valuable. That's the key idea behind this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is a STEM learning platform that designs these amazing interactive courses that take big and complex subjects like computer science, physics, or statistics, and breaks them down into smaller bite-sized chunks that you can learn at your own pace. You might only learn a small bit of statistics or physics in 5 minutes, but once you keep with it for long enough, filling up your occasional free 5 minutes with them, they begin to all add up together into a meaningful understanding of a subject you might have previously thought was impossible for you to really learn. I really think it's so cool that they allow you to get that satisfying feeling of achieving a challenging goal just by using the little free moments that you already have. And the best part is that anybody can learn on Brilliant regardless of their prior educational background, because they have extremely clear visualizations and explanations that then let you learn by doing through interactive challenges. So whether you're just beginning your learning journey in a new subject you're excited about, or you're a seasoned expert wanting to brush up, you can try everything that Brilliant has to offer totally free for a full 30 days by clicking the button that's here on your screen right now, or by visiting brilliant.org/RealLifeLore. And on top of that, the first 200 of you to do so will get an additional 20% off discount of Brilliant's annual premium subscription. And you'll also be greatly helping out RealLifeLore while you're at it. And, as always, thank you so much for watching.